When I read the submission to speak from this next speaker in a spreadsheet, I was already intrigued enough to offer the invite. But meeting Alfi and hearing his story and learning from him has really made me thankful for his participation in this year's event. The SenseMaker community has a lot of work to do when it comes to effective mentorship, and we could not have asked for a better person to show us the way. Alfi Oloo is a product designer by trade, specializing in design systems. He is also the co-host of the Edit Undo podcast and a mentorship enthusiast. Among other things, Alfi is a lifelong student, and he is currently piloting a new mentorship framework in a small design agency that leverages best practices and aspects derived from psychology and performance coaching. He's here to talk to us today about a diagram that's at the center of that framework. The cause he chose to represent this year is the Komati Foundation, that's based in South Africa, and they support a students' residence program that Alfi has mentored through called Sprint that prepares students for professional environments through activities like mock interviews, career workshops, and excursions to different organizations.
I'm almost going to just dive right into my sort of presentation, just because I think it sort of almost tells the story about me, while at the same time telling the story about my diagram. Really, my intention around this is to speak to you a little bit about some of my experiences, specifically around mentorship, because I have had a less than typical journey in my professional career. So I am one of 4 boys, and I am number 3. And as you might have with 4 boys and no girl in sight, we were always playing, running around, climbing trees, and getting up to all kinds of mischief. And, you know, for a very long time, this was like my circle, because, you know, we were, my parents were foreigners to the country. And so because we always were around each other, we created this amazing little circle of what we called at that time our own little soccer team. And we were really close. And a lot of the things that we did together. And, you know, fast forward 20 years, that relationship sort of changed. And from actual embodied games, it kind of became a thing that was a little bit more cerebral, a little bit more abstract. And discussion was always at the center of a lot of our family occasions and engagements. And the thing that was kind of interesting about us, which I only learned later on was not so typical, was that we actually never fought. We argued, we shouted, we occasionally almost threw things, but it never descended into, you know, a physical confrontation. And this is interesting for a reason that I will touch on a little bit later. But the one thing that does separate me from my family, which our previous speaker sort of mentioned as well, is my dyslexia, my general struggle with everything academic, and specifically relating to reading. Because, I mean, my father is a civil engineer, my mother is a teacher, my eldest brother is also an engineer who did his honors and now is the head of the design at a bank. My other brother is in human genetics, and, you know, he has a published paper, all of these amazing things. And then you get me. And I took a little bit of a different path. I saw all of those green and beautiful things and decided that instead we need to take a walk into the desert. And so I ended up eventually dropping out of university. But right before I did that, I spent a month job shadowing under some designers at a bank here in South Africa. And that's when I got into design. And I only realized later on that it was only because of that opportunity to be mentored by designers and professionals that I'd be able to grow into the person that I've become today. And so what I'd like to do is explain how this idea of conversation and engagement that my family sort of participated in helped me actually learn and develop in the areas that school wasn't able to necessarily help me. You know, it really helped me learn how not only learn new things from the things that we would speak about, it also taught me how to learn. And so in some ways, I'm going to speak to you about a specific diagram, not one that I invented myself or discovered, but one that I've used. And I'd like to talk to you about the ways that I actually have used it. And so in this idea, it's sort of a way to map the world and to map your knowledge and learning. And at the center, you've got the area of mastered knowledge, the things that you know how to do, the things that you're very, you know, capable in, and that don't necessarily pique your interest because you know what you're doing. It's not very, very new to you. And then there's this whole other large domain of things that you don't know yet, things that you can't necessarily do. But a psychologist named Lev Vygotsky speaks about a very interesting center point, because the things that we know are really low risk and don't necessarily grab our interest, and things outside are maybe a lot more high risk. And although they force us to pay attention to them because of their danger, some of them are outside of our capability to actually resolve. And so the zone of proximal development is this area right outside the things that we're capable of doing, which actually engender the most productive learning. And so if we were to think a little bit about some of the aspects of the brain, there are two systems that are sort of relevant to this conversation. And you'll be familiar with the idea of fight or flight. And those are governed by two systems: the prefrontal cortex, which is the almost logical and processing side of the brain, the thing that allows us to abstract and so on. And then the amygdala, which is our emotional center. And it sort of takes control over things when there is any kind of risk or any kind of danger. And our ability to process and our ability to think logically gets stunted. And so the interesting thing that Vygotsky mentioned about the zone of proximal development is that when you have a mentor or when you have a more knowledgeable person, what they do is they expand that area of safety. They allow you to try things that you typically wouldn't be able to do on your own. And this was what I actually experienced when shadowing under those designers at the bank. I got to see what a designer's life is like, what it could possibly mean for me as a future. And if I were to find my own way, what might that look like? And so, as I mentioned, the zone of proximal development isn't my contribution to this, but instead it's a couple of different ways to actually use it. And the first is about knowing what role a mentor actually plays, because when you think about the challenges that a person faces, there are different responses that are appropriate for different kinds of challenges. For the things that are outside their capability, even with help, you want to give advice, you want to give support, you want to show them that they are safe under your supervision. But in that zone of proximal development, where a little bit of growth can actually help resolve the problem and help them learn new things, you want to focus on questions, you want to focus on the things that actually draw a person's abilities and skills out. And this is one of the reasons why Socratic dialogue was such a successful teaching mechanism, because it really focused on the questioning and the technique of questioning. And lastly, in that middle center of the things that they already know and the things that they are capable of, that is where you can engender trust by showing that you trust them to achieve those things by themselves. The second one is dealing with large-scale problems. For anyone who has either been a manager, a mentor, a parent, any kind of supportive entity in a relationship, there always eventually comes a problem that seems too big, either too big for your mentee to deal with or too big that you don't even know necessarily what to do. And here we take a leaf out of the psychological literature and the domain of therapy. Because what a therapist does when you have got a real problem, if they are worth their salt, is instead of solving a problem for you, they'll help you break a problem down into its constituting pieces until you find one that is small enough that you are willing to actually take it on voluntarily. And through that voluntary acceptance, you actually allow yourself to step into the zone of proximal development. And the third one, and I'd say probably the most important one, is understanding how we actually need to think about the challenges that mentees will actually bring to a mentor. And in that outside space that's outside of their ability and outside their domain of knowledge, and even outside of their capabilities with help, we want to create safety. That this, it's maybe even getting a little bit of a buzzword now, but the idea of psychological safety, that is the place for psychological safety. But there is a place for a little bit of risk. And what you want to do is allow for risk in the areas that are within their capability if they stretch themselves. And that's where you allow for failure as a mentor. And when they do eventually fail, which they eventually will, otherwise they wouldn't be learning, that is actually where you let them know that if worst comes to worst, you will be there. And then it starts to step into that domain where you want to create safety. And last but not least, in the center, in the areas where they are capable and they're knowledgeable, you want to encourage them to be a mentor to somebody else, thus keeping that knowledge that is typically a little bit more boring, interesting by having another person's point of view. And in closing, the thing that was so interesting about this is many years after I dropped out and started my professional career, my younger brother was in his final years of studying. And eventually he realized that he was also going to drop out of university because he also struggled with the structure, with and a lot of other things. But it was only through my reflecting through my own experiences and looking at it through this perspective was I able to help him find his own way. And he is now a software engineer and he is doing some very interesting things. But it sort of just closes the circle on this idea of mentorship. And because you never really know when fate will ask you to be a mentor to somebody else.